Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Keith Bybee, and I direct the Institute for the Study of Judiciary, Politics, and the Media here at Syracuse University. And I welcome you today to the final lecture in our semester-long lecture series on law, politics, and the media. This is a lecture series that is jointly sponsored by IJPM and the Carnegie Legal Reporting Program at Newhouse, and it's also associated with the Law, Politics, and Media course that's cross-listed at the College of Law, Maxwell School, and the Newhouse School. For those of you who have been following this lecture series, you know that we've had a variety of speakers come in and discuss judicial independence. And although there have been different perspectives and opinions about judicial independence, its status, its direction in the United States, I think it's fair to say that there's been a shared assumption among all these speakers that there are a group of actors in the United States who are opposed to judicial independence. Let's call these actors elected officials. That they seek in one way or another to bring the courts to heel, that they view the courts as another opportunity to pursue their own policy agenda. They either pressure judges or lobby to have ideological fellow travelers either elected or appointed to the bench, so the judiciary falls in line with elected officials' preferences. This is, as I say, been something of a running assumption. Sometimes it comes to the surface and it's explicitly discussed by some of the speakers we've heard. Other times it's in the background, in one way or another, influencing what's been said. Today we have the opportunity to squarely address that assumption and to talk about whether it's true or not, and to get the degree to which it's false, what else is going on. And we're fortunate enough to have with us today a person who's ideally suited for this discussion. His name is Christopher Nevitt. He is a member of the Denver City Council. He was elected to the City Council in 2007. Colorado has been a site in recent years of political attempts to alter the structure of the state judiciary. Attempts that have been widely understood to advance the interests of some political groups rather than others. And Chris is going to talk about that particular set of events and reflect more broadly about the relationship that elected officials have to judicial independence. Chris is well suited for this process of reflection. He has a PhD in political science, which he earned from the University of California at San Diego. Prior to his election to the City Council in Denver, he founded the Front Range Economic Strategy Center, which was a research, policy, and public interest organizing arm of the Metro Denver labor union movement. And so he's kind of one of these sort of egghead types, egghead teamster type. You know the type. Very common. Chris has also traveled extensively and has lived for extended periods in different parts of the globe, including Thailand, Nigeria, Australia, Sweden, China, and Russia. He also at one point traveled cross-country in the United States in an old Dodge that had its seats ripped out and replaced with these soiled mattresses. I know this because I was on that trip. And that trip changed my life until a doctor prescribed an antibiotic ointment that got everything back to normal. Please join me in welcoming Christopher Nevitt.
Not having university health care, I still suffer from that. So as Professor Bybee said, I come out of the academy. I have a PhD in political science, but I'm a politician now, and so I'm no longer under the obligation to present any kind of sort of well-developed theory and then backing that up with investigation of what the facts are and testing my theory against other facts. I don't have to do that. I'm a politician. I just tell stories, and it's up to you to judge whether or not they're even true and whether or not they're germane to this. But I hope it is germane to this, because the story that I want to tell you is a really, really interesting one. There's a reason I think I was brought here to talk about the attack on judicial independence in Colorado, and the role that I played, and the role that politics played, and the role that other political actors played in the story. So just to sort of frame it up for you, it's a story of the establishment of judicial independence in Colorado. 40 years later, a thorough attack on that judicial independence, and the highly contingent nature of the successful defeat of that attack. The highly contingent nature of the successful defeat of that attack. And maybe I'm inclined to tell a story rather than present a theory, because the story kind of defies theoretical categories, defies a theoretical approach to understanding the problem and understanding the outcome. A lot of weird things had to fall into place to make the outcome what it was. So let me sort of frame the judicial independence part first. And I think y'all know some of this already. I think Kyle told me that Rebecca Love Corliss was here last year and talked about the establishment of the merit system in Colorado. So in excuse me, in 1966, Colorado passed a constitutional amendment that changed the way judges became judges. Prior to 1966, judges in Colorado, like many places, were elected. And so, they raised money and they ran for election. But in 1966, the Constitution was changed so that judges, instead of being elected, were appointed by the governor. Now, you think, well, that's not really sort of judicial independence. You're just changing one set of accountabilities for another, electoral accountability for gubernatorial accountability, but you may be able to put them out of reach of the governor by making them lifetime appointments. But the governor wasn't free to simply appoint whoever he thought was fit, or, as Professor Bybee suggested, whoever shared his political views, or his semi-retarded brother-in-law. He couldn't just sort of select anybody that he wanted to fill these slots on the Supreme Court, the appeals court, trial courts. A judicial commission was established that would nominate judges for his selection. And the judicial commission consisted of a lawyer and a non-lawyer drawn from each congressional district in Colorado. So, some parts of Colorado are Democratic, some parts of Colorado are Republican, but you'd have to have a lawyer and a non-lawyer from each congressional district. And the partisan makeup of the commission was required to be no political party could have a majority. So, by definition, you couldn't have a Democratic majority on this commission. You couldn't have a Republican majority on this commission. And that commission's job was to sort of analyze the field of candidates for open trial court, appeals court, Supreme Court seats, and make judgments about who was the best. They were meant to sort of arrive at who the best candidates were for these seats, and then nominate 3 of them to the governor for appointment. Now, I'm the last person to say that there is any unbiased way of selecting anybody, but with this explicitly nonpartisan or multi-partisan commission, specifically charged with trying to find the best in the legal community to fill these seats, you have a much better chance of getting people of at least some quality. And then the governor makes the appointment. Excuse me. The governor makes the appointment, but the governor doesn't have free rein. He can only choose from among those that are presented to him by the commission. And then once they're appointed, 2 years after their appointment, they face a retention election. So the voters do get a crack at them 2 years after they've been appointed. And I can't remember if it's the same entity that does the analysis, but there's an analysis of the performance of those judges after 2 years. Part of it's survey analysis, so plaintiffs' attorneys, defense attorneys, prosecutors, criminal defense attorneys, the criminal defense bar. They have a survey, and they get information from them. You think this judge was partial, impartial, did a good job, didn't do a good job, etc. And all that is kind of condensed into a report card that the voters are given when they go to the polls. So, the reporters have this sort of professional analysis, are these judges worth a damn after 2 years in there? And then the voters get to decide, do we keep them or do we ditch them? If we keep them, then Supreme Court justices get to serve for 10 years. Their term is 10 years. Appellate court judges, 8 years. Trial judges, 6 years. But there's no limit on terms. So after your that sort of 2-year probationary period, then you face a retention election for Supreme Court 10 years down the road, and you can keep serving. Now, the other thing that was of concern, of course, is judges that become they were great in their day, and they become doddering old fools, and you can't get rid of them because it's a lifetime appointment. In addition to all this, there was a 72-year-old mandatory retirement at the age of 72. So you can't serve in the Supreme Court, appeals court, or trial court after the age of 72. So this was a pretty good system, and I don't sort of come out of the judicial community. This is not sort of my area of expertise or interest necessarily, so I didn't know this. But as I became involved in this whole episode, it was apparent that the Colorado legal community was incredibly proud of this. This was, and you'll actually see why it kind of runs against the political grain of Colorado in many ways. But they were incredibly proud of having this system, and they held it up as something that, hey, Colorado's, sort of in the leading edge of the nation here with this system. So that lasted from 1966 till 40 years later, 2006, where it came under fundamental existential attack by a guy named John Andrews. And John Andrews, just to sort of frame it up for you, John Andrews comes from the right-wing libertarian freak show wing of the Republican Party. He's sort of, he's a Grover Norquist Republican. He's with the Republicans that believe that we don't want to eliminate government entirely. We simply want to make it small enough so that we can drown it in the bathtub. That's where John Andrews comes from. John Andrews was also president of the Colorado State Senate. So, that's in Colorado, that, kind of the nut job wing has power, and he was president of the Colorado State Senate, and he had a particular animus to the Supreme Court because he tried to pursue a midnight redistricting. Y'all remember Tom DeLay in Texas? And Tom DeLay, the way redistricting works is, every 10 years we have a census, and after the census we reapportion the voting population to congressional seats, state legislative seats, etc. And the convention is that we do it every 10 years. We have the census, we reapportion, and then we wait 10 years to the next census before we do it again. Tom DeLay, and I got to hand it to the guy, he's a tricky bastard. He thought, we'll do this in the middle of the span and reapportion the Texas congressional seats in kind of midstream. And I don't know if you remember this, the Texas state legislature actually fled the state and was hiding out in other states like fugitives from justice in order to avoid being subpoenaed and dragged back to the state legislature, where they would then form a quorum and the Republican majority could redistrict in this way. That was successful. John Andrews tried that in Colorado, and he wasn't successful because the Colorado Supreme Court told him, nope, unconstitutional, you can't do it. So he was chapped, deeply and profoundly chapped. And he vowed vengeance. Sounds like an opera, doesn't it? He was like, 20 minutes singing on the... So he vowed vengeance. He was going to get them come hell or high water. Now, you would think, okay, here's this kind of right-wing nutcase who's got this personal vendetta against the Colorado Supreme Court, and he is going to, he's vowed to destroy them, and he pursues this agenda. Surely that, doesn't have legs. Surely that's not going to work. Surely, this is sort of, weirdo wingnut action. Quite to the contrary. And I'll explain why this had such legs, why it was not just a viable measure, but had every expectation of actually passing. Number one, of course, is John Andrews himself. Prominent, highly motivated. Number two is Colorado has its own... Colorado mines a very deep vein of anti-government nutjobbery all its own. And it's actually enshrined in Colorado's Constitution from the beginning. New York has a professional legislature. The New York legislature meets through much of the year in Albany. They're paid a decent salary. Their only job is to be a legislator. And, society's complex, the economy's complex, government is large and complicated. You need dedicated, smart professionals who compete for these jobs in order to help direct it. Not so in Colorado. Colorado's whole sort of view of government was, we do not want professionals. We do not want people whose job it is to engage in politics. We want a citizen legislature. We want the farmers and ranchers and miners to show up every once in a while, make the few laws that are necessary, and then go back to their ordinary jobs. And so Colorado's Constitution, the legislative session is 120 days, 4 months, by the Constitution. If you can't get your work done in 120 days, everybody goes home. So there's this sort of deep, we can't have professional legislators. In fact, we just radically increased the salary of Colorado's legislators, and they are now paid the princely sum of about $30,000. So they make about $30,000 a year for this. My view is you get what you pay for, and so there's this sort of anti-government, suspicion of professional government ethos out there. Colorado also has, more sort of indicative of this, has the most draconian controls on government spending and government revenue. There are some states in the Union that have statutory limits on the amount that they can spend. There are other states in the Union that have statutory limits on the amount of revenue that they can take in. Colorado is perhaps the only, or at least among the very few states in the Union, that has a constitutional limit both on the amount that government can spend and on the amount of revenue that the state takes in. Colorado was an early adopter of term limits. Again, this is all sort of consistent with that ethos of we're suspicious of government, we're suspicious of the professional quality of government. And finally, the third thing that made this on its face a winning proposition, John Andrews' measure a winning proposition, is that it is absolute child's play to get things on the Colorado ballot. It's very, very easy to get onto the Colorado ballot. And again, this was written into the founding documents of the state of Colorado that we're suspicious of government, we're suspicious of what those bastards are doing up there, so we want to make it as easy as possible for the people to be able to rise up and change law independent of the state legislature. We want to be able to get around them if necessary. In fact, we guessed that there will be plenty of reasons for us to do that. And so it's very, very easy to get onto to get measures on the Colorado ballot. In fact, it's so easy to get onto the Colorado ballot that not only can you get legislative, statutory measures on the ballot, you can get constitutional amendments on the ballot with the same process. Now, back when they thought this up, of course, they were thinking, well, some things are appropriate for the, you need to make constitutional changes, other things are statutory. But if you think about any decision maker, and I certainly know this for myself, any decision maker wants to take their choices, make them, and then put them beyond the reach of future decision makers. I don't want my choices to be overturned or reversed by somebody else. I want to put them beyond the reach of decision makers, regardless of how trivial or fundamental. And consequently, everybody in Colorado who goes to the trouble to get an initiative on the ballot goes for a constitutional amendment. In 2006, when Amendment 40 is what it came to be known as, when Amendment 40 was put on the ballot, it shared the ballot with 14 other measures. 14 measures, most of which were constitutional amendments. So you have a highly motivated person in John Andrews. You have a deep well of sort of, anti-government, suspicion of professional government in Colorado as a whole, and it's a snap to get on the ballot. So this was a fundamental threat to this judicial system that the Colorado legal community had made a huge investment in and was incredibly proud of. And so they leapt into action to fight against Amendment 40. And so, who do you think sort of came forward to, sort of lead the charge to, fight against Amendment 40, to point out, John Andrews' true agenda, and that what we have in Colorado is actually for the best and widely admired around the country.
Could I ask you what Amendment 40 said?
What?
Sorry.
These are details.
I know.
Excellent point. Amendment 40, thank you, Keith.
Yes.
Amendment 40 created judicial term limits. So rather than being able to serve, successive terms, judges would face the same term limits as legislators. In fact, every elected official in Colorado. And this was actually, I'm glad you asked that question since I hadn't pointed it out. One of the key features of Amendment 40, and you can understand exactly why it was written this way, is that the term limits would be retroactive. And that means that the bench would be stripped. So 5 out of 7 of the Supreme Court justices would, after Election Day, be bounced off the bench. Almost half of the appellate court judges would be bounced off the bench.
Just a quick question. Was there a problem with the judges that sparked this, that they wanted to?
No, that's a good question, but there was no sort of groundswell of oh, the judges are making these terrible decisions, or, these damn judges, can't we get rid of them? There was none of that. It was really John Andrews and a few people like him who were particularly pissed off about the redistricting decision. There was another decision that had to do with an issue getting on the ballot having to do with illegal immigration, but that just added fuel to the fire. He was already ragingly pissed off at them. But there was no real sort of, groundswell of opposition to the judiciary. But again, given sort of what I described about the Colorado climate, it became very easy for John Andrews to sort of prey on, I make him sound like such a jerk. He is a jerk, but to prey on that ethos and to say judges are out of control, they're legislating from the bench. I mean, you've heard all this before, and people say it about the judiciary and other places, but it really wasn't the case in Colorado. But it was a very easy message to deliver, very easy case to make. These judges, they're in there for life. They're liberal commies, and they're doing whatever the hell they want to, and they're standing in the way of the people, etc. It was a very easy message to deliver. So the legal community leapt into action, and the Colorado Bar Association did a fantastic job circling the wagons, rallying the troops, etc. But think about what that means. Think about who these spokespeople are. Think about what the message would be that would be coming out of the legal community. So who are the spokespeople? Number one is judges. But, their credibility is undermined immediately because it's their jobs that are at stake. So they're busily telling the Colorado voters, hey, don't do this. This is a terrible idea. Throwing judges out like me is a really bad idea. So, they clearly have an interest in it. Plus, they've just spent 40 years cultivating this sense that they are not political. They're not elected. They've been chosen by merit and retained by the people. That they are judges. They're not advocates. And so A, they weren't credible because they had a stake in the outcome, and B, they were lousy advocates anyway, just by sort of personality. So who's left? Well, the rest of the legal community. Now, as a politician, I can say this, but I think there's no group more reviled than lawyers, unless it's politicians. And so, lawyers out there making the argument to the public, like, boy, God, this system is great, and, you shouldn't throw it out, the baby with the bathwater, people saw lawyers as making the case as, again, highly uncredible. In fact, the opposite of credible. Well, if lawyers think this is a good idea, or if lawyers think this is a bad idea, surely it's a good idea, and John Andrews is onto something. And lawyers being lawyers, how many of y'all are part of the law program? So I want to understand how many people I'm insulting here. Oh, so most of you, good, excellent. How many of you are from the journalism side? Journalism, great job. And and sort of politics, Maxwell School. You're all three, aren't you? Yeah. Well, lawyers are great at arguing. That's what y'all do. But in the political context, in a legal context, of course, that's what you do. That's what you're supposed to do. But in a political context, you don't push the voter. You can't push voters. What you have to do is you have to meet voters where they are and give them a reason to follow you to a different place. That's not what lawyers are generally good at. So the lawyers were making complex, complicated arguments on the merits of the case that voters were viewing as completely implausible, and the messenger is suspect right from the beginning, and the arguments were complicated and made no sense to voters not paying attention. Why weren't voters paying attention? Because there were 14 other things on the ballot. including legalization of marijuana. So, there was a lot more exciting stuff than judicial independence on the ballot. So people weren't even paying attention. In the summer before the election, elections in November, in the summer before the election, this measure was polling at 70%. That is a huge hill to climb. Running a no campaign is always easier than running a yes campaign, but nonetheless, when yes is running at 70%, that is a huge hill to climb. And it was hard to raise money. The original budget for the no campaign was about a little over $2 million. They only ended up raising $1.3 million, and $1.2 million of that was directly from the legal community. In other words, they got about $100,000 from people who were not lawyers in law firms, etc. So they raised very little money outside of the legal community. And they had all this ballot noise. So they were in a very, very deep hole. And what they did, and again, this is part of the contingent nature of the outcome, the legal community did two very smart things, or they did one smart thing, and then that led to the second smart thing. The first smart thing was to hire campaign professionals, so professional campaign consultants, and the professional campaign consultants changed the message, and then the campaign consultants also changed the messenger. So, again, more contingent qualities to the outcome. The campaign professionals that they hired were actually friends of mine. So I had a close relationship with them. In fact, one of them, the general consultant, was the former political director of the Colorado AFL-CIO. So he was a guy who had a tight connection to the union movement, a tight connection to me. Another one of the campaign consultants, just as smart as a whip, they made a great choice here, was a woman by the name of Ellen Brilliant. Isn't that a great name? Ellen Brilliant? In fact, I'll tell you a kind of sad, it's a funny but sad story. At one of the meetings of community allies for the No on 40 campaign, we're going around the room, people are identifying themselves, Joe Schmo, Jane Doe, etc. And they get to her and she says, "My name is Ellen Brilliant," and then the next person, and the woman sort of like bugs her eyes out like that and goes, "My name is Ellen Dumb." It's D-U-M-M, but still. And I know Ellen Dumb, and she's actually very smart, but I think it was, I don't know, if your name is Ellen Brilliant, it's, nomen et omen. You can't help but be successful. And she's extremely smart. And so they did a bunch of focus groups, and they figured out a completely different message for the No on 40 campaign. And like I said, they went to voters where they lived and gave them a reason to follow them to a different place. And the message was kind of three basic pieces. The first was, term limits are great. Term limits are fine. We all like term limits, but in this case, it goes too far. These term limits will, wipe out the bench, and that goes too far. We like term limits, but in this case, the effect of this is going to, wipe out the bench all at once, and that's a bad idea. So they already sort of, seeded the ground. Yes, term limits are fine, but this does a bad thing. And by wiping out the bench, by wiping out, most of the Supreme Court and half the appellate court, what we're doing, it's not like they didn't say, and this destroys the, the professional judges that we have and the institutional memory, etc. They said, if you think government sucks now, when all these judges are gone, it's going to be even worse the backlog in cases is going to be terrible. They're already, the wheels of government already grind slow. With all these judges gone, it's going to grind even slower. Government is going to become even more of an impediment to your life. And thirdly, think about this, folks. Thirdly, all those judges are gone. All those judges have to be replaced. They're all going to be replaced at one time. Who's going to replace them but the governor? And in 2006, the gubernatorial race was an open seat. So it was unclear. Would the governor be a Democrat? Would the governor be a Republican? It was a really, really highly contested race. And so each side could be, told, whoa, if you're a Democrat, do you want a Republican appointing 5 of the 7 Supreme Court justices, half of the appeals court? And for Democrats, or what did I do first? Anyway, you get the picture. So, it again sort of played to that sense that politics and politicians are not to be trusted, and politicians should not be given the power to appoint the huge chunk of the court. And then that court would be, out of reach for a whole term, for 10 years. So they changed the message to meet voters where they were, to accede to their initial prejudices, but give them a reason to go in a different direction. Term limits are fine, but they go too far. Government will become even more slow, backlogged, inefficient, and you don't want to give power to politicians to make all these appointments and politicize the court. So that started to, that was a much, much more effective message to the public. The other thing that they did was change the messenger. And that's where I come in. So, the judges were terrible spokespeople. Lawyers were terrible spokespeople. They needed different people making the case, and the strategy they arrived at, this wasn't the complete strategy, but it was a central part of it. The strategy they arrived at was to have the union movement and the business community together advocating against Amendment 40. So, it's kind of like, having the Israelis and the Palestinians on the same side for something. Like, wow, A, it gets your attention, and B, wow, there really must be something to it if these people who can never agree with one another are actually on the same side and advocating in the same direction. So it would be kind of like a man bites dog story. Wow, union movement and business community together at last, and they're all saying Amendment 40 is a terrible thing and you shouldn't vote for it. So unionists would buy the message, pro-business people would buy the message, and the thing would be defeated. And I had, again, sort of the contingent nature of these outcomes, I had my own reasons for wanting to pursue this strategy, and this was 2006. I ran for office in 2007. The Denver business community is a very big player in Denver politics. I had my base in the union movement, but I wanted the business community not to be wholeheartedly against me. I didn't want to have to fight against them more than I needed to, and so I was motivated to reach out to the business community to show myself as someone who's interested in working with business, someone who wants to work with business, someone who's able to build bridges, not burn them. And so I was highly motivated from my position in the union movement to try to build that bridge. Here's the thing. That was extremely hard. I mean, I'm showing you all the barriers that stood in the way here. That was extremely hard because in 2006, the union movement and the business community were at absolute war. Absolute war. Just to give you sort of a perspective of, union business relations in Colorado, people generally don't think of Colorado as a very, you don't think unions. Colorado. Unions are a New York thing, a Boston thing, a Chicago thing, a Los Angeles, San Francisco thing. Not really sort of associated with Colorado, but in fact, Colorado has has a deep union history. Remember the Alamo. The Alamo is one of those sort of like foundational events in Texas history. Remember Ludlow. The Ludlow massacre in Ludlow, Colorado was one of the foundational events in the history of the United Mine Workers. So the Pinkertons and the state militia killed a bunch of people at Ludlow. That was one of the founding moments of the United Mine Workers. Pueblo Steel, outside of Pennsylvania, the biggest steel town in the country was Pueblo, Colorado. So United Steelworkers, very, very strong there. A lot of unions, the numbers of locals, as they got incorporated, they're numbered sort of historically. So for the hotel workers, Local 1 is in Chicago. It's the first hotel workers local. But a lot of locals in Colorado are low-number locals. The grocery workers local, Local 7. Sheet metal workers, operating engineers, Local 9. So there's this, deep union history in Colorado. But over the last 50 years, that had really dissipated. Union density had really dropped. And as Colorado had grown, a lot of business people had come there since then, and they didn't think of Colorado as a union place. They thought, it's the Wild West, it's, low taxes, it's, pro-business. And so unions were like this, atavistic irritation. And so the business community felt very entitled and mostly just annoyed by the union movement. But the union movement, of course, felt very embattled. And, this used to be a union place and it will be a union place once again. About 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, the union movement started making a real comeback. They got a lot of young, dynamic, new leaders. They began organizing in a way they hadn't before. They began building bridges to the larger progressive community, and I'd like to think that I played a part in that, building these bridges so that we became an ally of others and people became supportive of the union movement in a way they hadn't before, and we started winning elections. We became very, very good at turning our members out. Democrats are not a majority of union members in Colorado, but 90% of our voters, union members, vote Democratic. So we became very good at convincing our members to vote the right way. The demographic of unions, blacks, Latinos, working class whites, these are not high turnout demographics. You add union to that category, and we were turning them out at twice the rate of that demographic otherwise. So we started getting very good at elections. In 1998, Colorado was entirely red. Entirely red. Republican governor, both houses of the state legislature Republican, the majority of the congressional delegation Republican, and both U.S. senators Republican.
What year was that?
1998. Now, it's entirely blue. Democratic governor, both houses of the state legislature are very firmly in Democratic hands. The congressional delegation is majority Democrat, and both senators are Democrats. Now, a lot of things happened to contribute to that, but the resurgence of the union movement played a central part, and it was driving the business community out of their minds. In 2006, That was the cusp. The prize at stake was the governor's office, and we were going to win it. And it was driving the business community out of their minds. Not only that, we had figured out Karl Rove's, everybody learns from the successes of their enemies. Karl Rove had figured out, well, people don't necessarily turn out for a candidate, but they will turn out for an issue, and the best issue for the right is gay marriage, things like gay marriage. We figured out that's a great idea if we put a big increase to the minimum wage will drive turnout on our side. So we had minimum wage on the ballot, which the business community absolutely hated, and we were going to index it to inflation. We won, by the way. We indexed it to inflation, which they hated even more. They turned around and put gay marriage on the ballot, so we had gay marriage on the ballot, marijuana legalization, minimum wage, plus all these other things. So it was an absolutely crazy ballot, and we were at war with one another. So I got people into a room, knocked their heads together. No. It was a hard proposition to go to my side, the union side, and say, you know what, we need to step up here and be on the side of the judiciary. We need to defend the Colorado judiciary. We need to be part of the No on 40 campaign. And think of this is going to drive them even crazier because we're the responsible ones. We're the ones, taking the responsible step to defend the Colorado judiciary. The business community isn't there. The business community hasn't stepped up. And then some of the other campaign consultants who were involved in the campaign were going to the business community and making exactly the same case that, union movement's starting to step up. The union movement is defending the Colorado judiciary. You need to step up too. And again, as I described, I was highly motivated to make this case, highly motivated to be the ambassador to the business community, to bring them on board, say, hey, we've got all these other fights, but those are separate fights. This is a fight we can be together on, and we should be together on. Now, did the union movement commit a lot of money to the No on 40 campaign? No, we committed no money at all. Did the business community commit a lot of money to the No on 40 campaign? A little bit, but not very much. We didn't really campaign for it. Neither did the business community. The fight was elsewhere. But what we did was put it on all our literature. So, we're great at turnout. We're great at education. We put it on all our literature. So as people were going down the ballot, it's like, your union says, Amendment 40, bad idea, serious consequences. No on 40. I don't think people sort of knew what the thing was, but it was like, your union says bad, no on 40. And the press conference, the kind of culmination of this was an October press conference where we had Ken Salazar, who's now the Secretary of Interior, but he was the senator from Colorado, a very sort of moderate Democrat, a hero to the business community, the left wing of the Democratic Party, very suspicious of him, but nonetheless a Democrat, holding this press conference where he has on the one side the president of the Colorado AFL-CIO, and on the other side the president of the South Metro Chamber of Commerce, both saying Amendment 40 is a terrible idea. I hate these bastards. I want to kill them, but we're all on the same side here. Amendment 40, don't do it. Bad idea. Serious consequences. And that was really kind of like the last nail in the coffin. I don't know what the right metaphor is, but the momentum really was sliding our way. When you had that kind of man bites dog story, business, labor, together on this one issue in the midst of the biggest fight that we've had in 20 years, and Amendment 40 went down in November 43%. So we went from 70%, and running smoothly in parallel with all the predilections of the Colorado voter, from 70% in the summer down to 43% in the first week of November. So that's my story. I'm sticking to it. I'll entertain any questions you have. But again, and maybe I'm just sort of like sort of doing two things at once, sort of reverting to my analytic, scientific frame of mind. But I think part of the lesson here is that there are a lot of big structural forces at work, but sometimes the outcome is determined by very contingent conditions, very odd conditions that are hard to identify from a certain level of generality. All those other structural conditions definitely had an impact, certainly in setting the stage, but the outcome was driven by some very odd choices. And one of them is, yours truly, the odd place that I held and my own ambitions helping move this coalition together. So that, you want me to answer questions directly, or?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes. So, questions?
Were you able to convince the factions on both sides of the actual merit of saying no to Amendment 40, or were they also using it as a stepping stone to getting maybe other issues passed? I mean, did you find that the workers' union really believed in saying no to Amendment 40 and as to the business community, or were they just using it as a political tool as well?
Yeah, I think the business community got it better. I think the business community understood. And in fact, this question came up at lunchtime. A lot of the interaction with the courts that unions have is with the federal courts. So, federal preemption, the NLRA, NLRB, these are, that's our court. So we actually had very little stake in, or saw very little stake in this issue in Colorado. I think the business community saw it much more clearly. But again, they weren't, excuse me, they weren't motivated because, oh my God, this is a terrible thing, we have to address this. It was the politics of the situation. If we hadn't been bugging them to come on board, they wouldn't have come on board. They had bigger fish to fry. Same thing with the union movement. They definitely wouldn't have come on board if we hadn't been bugging them. They had much bigger fish to fry.
If you weren't running for election, do you think you still would have took this issue on as much as you did?
Great question. And I think the answer would be yes, but maybe with not as much vigor. Because part of the role that I played, the Front Range Economic Strategy Center, the entity that I founded, was founded out of the Denver Area Labor Federation, and it was serving as the research and policy arm of the Metro Denver AFL-CIO. But it wasn't just research and policy. It was focused. It was a union community partnership organization. So our mission was to build bridges with, and it was mostly to other components of the progressive community. So, we used to have huge fights with the environmental community over development issues. We're unions. We like to build stuff. Environmentalists, they hate, sprawl and building things and dams, and we love dams and building things. And so, but there are also a lot of areas in which we have commonalities, and part of my job was to figure out what those commonalities were and draw the union movement and the conservation community closer together. Same thing with the low-income housing community. Same thing with the advocates for women coming off of welfare after the Clinton welfare reform. So, 9 to 5 National Association of Working Women, they became somebody that I reached out to who never saw unions as their allies or their advocates because, union members have a pension. Union members have health care. Union members can afford to buy a car and buy a home. These folks can't, but, bringing them together made us both more powerful. the business community was sort of the next logical step, trying to peel off the more progressive business community and show that unions can actually be a partner in economic development. And so we were already going there, but I had this additional motivation to demonstrate that I was somebody that they could work with. So maybe it accelerated that agenda. Maybe it made me even more motivated to get it done. But we were going in that direction.
One of the things you said was that one of your campaign strategies for getting people to vote no was that you were trying to get the public to believe that if you pass this amendment, the governor is going to appoint these people, and that's really dangerous. Do you think there are negative repercussions for you kind of misleading the public as to how the governor really goes about appointing it? Because now the public actually thinks it's more political than it is.
That's a great question. I mean, we made a deal, sort of a rhetorical deal with the devil. We've, instead of convincing people to think about this in a different and more responsible way, we've simply played to their prejudices and reinforced their prejudices, but framed it in such a way that they're, choosing in a way that we want them to. That's a great question. I think that's part of the moral hazard of politics, to be honest with you. Maybe we've done a long-term disservice by, sort of reinforcing those ideas, reinforcing those prejudices. The problem with politics is that if you don't win, you don't get to play. If we had lost, that would be it. It would be another 40 years before we could come back and fix it. Same thing with electoral politics. If you don't win, you don't get to make the choices of what's the right choice. You're just a has-been, and so it's a real moral hazard, I think. What compromises are you willing to make to get yourself in a position to make the right choices?
You talked about a 27-point swing in public opinion, and all I heard was about how you reached the voters was not a lot of money being spent, so that means not a lot of advertising, I assume. A press conference. How did you, over what period of time did this public opinion change, and what role did the press play?
It was a lot of advertising, and in fact, that's what, most campaigns have, paid media, earned media, and field. And field is really important. The No on 40 campaign just ditched field entirely. They did almost no field. They did sort of a speakers, not speakers bureau, but they sent people out to speak. They recruited community allies, and we were among them. We weren't the only ones, but they decided to spend, and it was an important strategic choice, is to spend all that money on advertising, to try to get their message out. They had great looking signs, great looking logo, vote 40, no, or vote no 40, that's what it was, vote no 40. It was very simple, very, it was yellow and black. It was really loud. And what was the slogan? Bad idea, serious consequences. They just hammered that home. They had one guy whose whole job during the whole campaign was to have meetings with editorial boards. So he was going around the state. That was all he did, was go around the state, have meetings with editorial boards to get them to write editorials. Because remember, there's 14 things on the ballot. So they're writing editorials about this and that. This could easily get lost, but it was kind of reinforcing that message. And since it was just one guy doing the whole thing, it was A, fairly cheap, and B, very consistent. So the editorials started coming out, bad idea, serious consequences, bad idea, serious consequences. And the field, they abandoned the field almost entirely. And we ended up doing their field, not that we were out there campaigning on that issue, but we were out there campaigning. We had not only the governor's race, but we had one of the 3 most competitive congressional races in the country. So tons of money was pouring into Colorado, and we were the point of the spear for a lot of the field on that. And so, we were carrying ridiculous amounts of stuff, going door to door and delivering these messages. And so we ended up being their field. But it was a big gamble. Most campaigns have a lot of field. They had almost none.
But besides editorials, did TV or newspapers cover this heavily, the back and forth of the debate?
No, not heavily. I mean, there was much more exciting stuff to cover. But I think, once a no campaign is always easier than a yes campaign. Even if it's something that, you saw this in some of the abortion debates. The anti-abortion crew. Well, wait, I got to use the right terms. The pro-life group would put something on the ballot, and the pro-choice group, if they were smart, they weren't saying, no, we're pro-abortion. Nobody wants to be pro-abortion. They would say, this goes too far. And so, you're sowing doubt in the voters' minds, and so enough voters thought, well, I like term limits, but this goes too far.
Sandra Day O'Connor is, she's retired from the Supreme Court. She's devoting herself to civic education. And she has a website for middle schoolers, and there are video games on it. And so you learn about judicial independence by playing video games.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, game on right
What does that look like? I really want to
Master level now.
Yeah, but it's not like, Grand Theft Auto where you're shooting people who are attacking judicial independence. But
take that sucker.
Do you think there's a role for this actually connects to some of the other questions and Claire's question, but actually teaching people about the substance of judicial independence? I mean, it seems like in the world that you've described, knowledge of how the system works and its values and virtues is really the preserve of the lawyers and judges who are part of the system. The rest of everybody else has to, by hook or by crook, be, and not quite tricked, but kind of, tricked into supporting the system that works. Do you think that there's a role for this alternative strategy, which is actual education of the larger population about the virtues and values that the professional community upholds? Or do you think that really the system you described, as contingent as it is really the only way that judicial independence will be defended in other venues?
Right. No, I think I'll try to redeem myself from being such a cynical bastard in this context, and that is absolutely, in the short term, you deal with the world as you find it. You meet the voters where they are, but in the longer term, I think education, changing the terms of the debate. I think these are absolutely critical. I mean, if you think about what the right has done over the last 30 years, trust in government used to be quite high. People trusted their government. People trusted people who worked in government. Government was viewed as, a positive force in people's lives. Taxes used to be really high. I mean, the top marginal rate during the Eisenhower administration was something on the order of 90%. But nobody batted an eye. That was perfectly reasonable. And it's taken 30 years, 40 years of hard work on the part of the right and the right-wing think tanks to change the terms of the debate, to frame things in a different way, to undermine that sense that government is here to help, and that taxes are anathema regardless of what they pay for. That's taken a long time and a lot of work and a lot of focused intellectual energy. I think to move in the other direction, not just on the broader perspective, but on this particular issue, is going to take a lot of the work that Sandra Day O'Connor and I love the idea of video games, but that whole enterprise is absolutely vital. I mean, I'm just a hack. I'm here to win the game
in the fourth quarter, but, you know, put a good team on the field, that's up to you guys.
We have time for one more question.
I just have a question. If you could design an initiative and you could put your counterpart on the ballot, would you change the Colorado judicial selection?
No, I think it's great.
Or do you think it's exactly
Yeah, I think it's exactly right. I mean, I was talking about this at lunch. You know, having judges elected is insane. I mean, that's just nutty. If you know, and I know myself, like what I have to do to raise money and the work that I have to do to satisfy constituents, and not just constituents as individuals, but, you know, constituencies. I can tell you right now that if my job were judicial rather than legislative, justice would not be done. I'm an advocate. I'm an advocate, and my job is to fight as hard as I possibly can and win every trick that I possibly can on behalf of those who put me where I am. If you relied on me to make sort of, you know, reasoned judgments about the law and where injustice lies, I'd be cheating left, right, and center, and justice could not be done. So I think electing judges is nuts. There you have it.
Okay, well, that might be a good place to stop. Please join me in thanking